For more on this story, we're joined by barrister and Assange advisor Greg Barns. Appreciate your time, Greg. What, in your view, was the most significant revelation on that first day of Mr Assange's extradition hearing?
Well, I think the maintenance of the position by the lawyers for the United States that people were put at risk and lives lost, which is an extraordinary statement given that in the Chelsea Manning trial, of course, Chelsea Manning was the person who served time after being found guilty of having leaked material. It was said by the US military that they had not been able to confirm whether anyone had been put at risk. In fact, they couldn't say that anyone had been put at risk. Furthermore, the Australian military during the Gillard government's years said the same thing. And so that revelation was extraordinary because it's contrary to what has been said in previous courts and by the Australian military.
But we did hear in court that some US informants disappeared after Wikileaks published their real names. That's not just coincidental, is it?
Well, that was said, Ashley, but what I'm saying is that there has been evidence given in the Chelsea Manning case in which the US military said that it couldn't establish that as a fact and in fact had no evidence that it could be put before that particular court. We also had the Australian military say something similar in 2012, and of course recently former Foreign Minister Bob Carr confirmed that in a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald.
So what happens from here? How does this extradition process play out?
Well, there'll be further, the defence case, as it were, will be laid out over the course of this week, and some evidence will begin to be called, and then it goes off until May. The real issue in this case, though, is that there's no doubt there's a shift in the Australian community. We've seen this morning in Australia Peter Grester, former journalist who, of course, found himself captive in Egypt, has written a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning in which he's now starting to shift position, having been hostile to Assange, starting to shift position. We saw George Christensen MP on Alan Jones's program last week. We're hearing, those of us who are around the Assange campaign, that there's greater momentum. Andrew Wilkie's trip to the UK last week, I think, has started to galvanise people and getting a lot of people saying, look, what did Julian Assange really do? He revealed the war crimes of the United States. He's an Australian citizen facing an effective death penalty for that fact. And so there is now, I think, some greater urgency in the matter and more people now saying, why doesn't the Australian government get involved?
And is Mr Assange's team buoyed by the fact that the UK has historically blocked a number of extraditions to the US, I think on human rights grounds, the most significant case being hacker Gary McKinnon recently?
Well, certainly the United Kingdom, and that was under a Conservative government, and certainly the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom courts actually have a problem when there's an effective death penalty and no parole. Recently there was a case, I think, of an Indian couple who the courts refused to send back to India because there was no chance of parole. But look, there's a long way to play out. As your reporter said, there'll be an appeal from this decision. This is going to play out. And one of the issues, of course, is that Julian's health, which has deteriorated and has been difficult, if he's still held in this sort of maximum security prison, you know, the endurance test that's required there is enormous. There is still room and time for Australia to get involved in this case.
In recent days, we've learned about secret recordings which were made at Mr Assange's former home, being the Ecuadorian embassy in London. What impact could those recordings have? I see Jeffrey Robertson has suggested that they could be a potential lifeline for Mr Assange.
Well, that's right, because what you've seen is an egregious breach and a fundamental breach of a right that you and I and everybody has. There are two groups of people that are important for people to have confidence in and know that their discussions are confidential. That is medical professionals and lawyers. And this is an egregious breach. It's an egregious breach which ought to be concerning to all Australians because this is an Australian citizen that it happened to. And particularly it shows a level of misconduct on the part of the United States, which is, you know, a key ally of Australia. And so it's extraordinary conduct. I've certainly, as a lawyer, not seen it done in the Australian context in a knowing sense. I mean, it may have been done, but certainly never in that sort of blanket way and such an overt way in this, as it has been in this particular case.
If Mr Assange is extradited, what's the worst case scenario here? What does his future hold?
Well, he could die. And I mean that literally, in a US prison. He would be subjected to a very harsh prison environment and face an effective death penalty of 170 years. Even if it's short of 170 years and it's 100 years or 80 years, that is an effective death penalty. And Australia, of course, is opposed to the death penalty, as is the UK, and that's something that I think should exercise everyone's minds. You know, should we send a person knowingly to a position where they would face those sorts of conditions?
Greg Barns, appreciate your insights. Thank you. We'll be watching closely how that plays out this week.